Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's Sydney Ideas. My name is Fenella Kernebone. I'm the head of programming for Sydney Ideas, and it's a great pleasure to have your company as we consider the challenges and the advantages of AI and how it's changing medical practice. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before we continue, I would firstly like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We are coming to you live now on Zoom webinar, but the University of Sydney is on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and so I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I further acknowledge the traditional custodians of country, wherever you happen to be joining us today, wherever you live, where you work, where you connect, and where you share ideas. And I also pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. And if you would like to share where you might be right now, what country you on, please feel free to do so in the chat. Before I welcome our moderator, just a couple of quick things to share with you before we have this fantastic discussion. To access the live captions tonight throughout this talk, you can use the code that should be on the screen right now, and it will be put up on the chat for you a couple of times throughout tonight's event. We're also really keen to hear your questions. So if you'd like to share a question, the way we're going to do it tonight is through Slido, slido.com. Pop that into your browser or into your phone or something like that and use the code Sydney Ideas. And that way we can all see what questions are there and our hosts can go through them as well. So questions on slido.com if you can. If you'd like to tag Sydney Ideas, we are on Twitter and Facebook. We are hashtag Sydney Ideas. And we would love to hear from you too. And just a reminder that this event, along with all of our other events, will be available on demand, both as video and podcast in the coming days. Okay, thanks again for joining us. And now it's time to go to our speakers. So over to you, Professor Kimberly Weatherall.
Thank you, Fenella. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm really, really excited to be hosting this event. I'm Kimberly Weatherall, and I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Sydney and a Chief Investigator with the ARC Centre of Excellence on Automated Decision Making and Society, which is dedicated to researching and furthering responsible, ethical and inclusive automated decision making. And I'm really excited, and ADMS is really excited to be hosting Professor Frank Pasquale from the Brooklyn Law School tonight. Frank Pasquale is an extraordinary scholar with wide-ranging interests across law, political economy, literature, philosophy, and so much more. And he's been ahead of the curve on many of the issues confronting us in the digital world. His 2016 book, The Black Box Society, raised the alarm about the growth of inscrutable digital technologies, something we're constantly talking about today. And his more recent book, The New Law of Robotics, asks us to think about the rules that should apply as robotics becomes more advanced, ranging beyond Asimov's 3 famous laws to argue, for example, that robots should have to declare themselves and not pretend to be human, and so much more. Today, though, Frank's going to be talking to us about the impact of AI on healthcare and medical practice, a topic that could not be more timely. When responses to COVID have raised our awareness of the importance of rapid data-driven responses, when Amazon, Google and others are making investments in healthcare and health data, and the EU and many other countries are racing to apply AI to massive pooled data for healthcare research. And after Frank speaks for about 20 minutes, we'll follow up with a dialogue. And at that point, Frank and I will be joined in this virtual stage by Associate Professor Justin Skono. Justin is Director of Research in Paediatric Anaesthesia at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, where he's also a project lead for a project Big Data for Small People, which is a collaborative critical care informatics program. And I mean, it could not be more important, again, in this sort of conversation to have that medical perspective as well as everything Frank is about to share with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm going to hand over to Frank.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. That was such a generous introduction, and it was particularly an honor to be introduced by you, given how much you've contributed to our understanding of intellectual property and your research on ADM and related law and technology issues. I really appreciate that, and am very grateful for this opportunity to be on such an august panel, and just really pleased to have a medical professional with deep knowledge and expertise joining us as well. So today I will share some slides to sort of guide us through and give some visuals here with respect to our journey through AI in medical practice and trying to understand it. Let me just show the entire show. And I'm going to provide today a law and policy perspective because I think it is really critical to consider both how we understand law, AI, and medicine from a medical perspective, but also from a law, policy, and ethics perspective. There are enormous numbers of very difficult issues that are going to be on the horizon. And I think in some ways, understanding how the values at stake are going to be reimagined in a world of pervasive artificial intelligence, chatbots, robots, et cetera, that's going to be a great challenge for us, both as academics, but also as citizens, as people working through how best to structure state support and regulation of the medical sector. So to start with, I wanted to just go back to the old dream of AI in medicine. This, for those of you who are Trekkies, you'll probably recognize this as the tricorder. This is a device that was used in Star Trek to instantly diagnose and treat many forms of ailments. And the dream behind a device like this is full automation, right? That you could essentially create a fully automated system for treating and diagnosing disease. And I say about 10 years ago, this was a big part of the dream of AI in medicine in general. There was just a lot of enthusiasm for having this type of device that would, or at least a dream of automating so many aspects of medical practice. And it was a noble dream in the sense that there are many people that are not able to access the medical system, and particularly thinking about areas in the world with very low incomes and low numbers of medical professionals. But the sad reality is that this original dream has been delayed and is perhaps indefinitely delayed as those who work in AI and computer science and related fields grapple with the ongoing need for intervention and advice and mediation between the technology and patients. And that mediation, of course, is provided by doctors and by nurses and by many other medical professionals. Now, once we get beyond that original dream, we look to examples in ongoing medical practice and in the most advanced forms of AI that are in common use, like in search engines. Those sorts of devices, those sorts of processing of information, they are sometimes held forward as a first step toward automation, right? But the example I give in this slide of search results that come up when people search for something like colloidal silver on the left-hand side, I think they show that there's just a lot to be desired in automated processes for, say, arranging medical information. You look for some things online, and of course I will defer to medical experts as to which of these things is actually true, but you can imagine that anyone trying to figure out if they should take or shouldn't take colloidal silver would be baffled by this and would want to get the advice of an actual medical professional as opposed to, say, relegating it to Dr. Google. You also see on the right-hand side of the slide what's known as a card in Google search. And essentially what happened with respect to Google's efforts to order medical information is that for a while, the philosophy was that what was used with respect to Google for any particular type of search could be used for medical searches, that there would be this something like a general intelligence of search that would help people find what the best results were. But several years into that approach, they decided that they really needed to bring in medical experts to develop things like the card that you see on the right-hand side in the cell phone. And so these are not automated results when you see a card like this or sort of an image on the right-hand side on a desktop computer for a search. They're actually showcase human-computer interaction and cooperation. And that'll be a theme of my talk tonight, that the real goal of AI in medicine is not going to be to replace doctors or indeed many other medical professionals, but it's going to be to provide different types of decision support, advice, error reduction, quality assurance. All of those things are going to really, I think, be the new AI dream in medicine, and there's still a lot to be done there. Now, one thing that we can note is that there are thinkers out there, like Dr. Eric Topol, a very esteemed and very perceptive analyst of the scene, who suggests things like AI for the simple things, right? The idea that Amazon could assume drug distribution, that they could start using voice platforms like Alexa to help discuss symptoms and get feedback, to coordinate hospital post-op care through voice-activated AI, and to do these and other rote things, right? So this is one vision for the future of AI in medicine, that we're going to see a future where things like care coordination, things like telling people how they ought to act post-surgery, when they can say after a knee surgery, how active the knee should be, how they should move the knee, things like that, that would be the goal for using AI for these things. But I will say that the question becomes, from a law and policy perspectives, are these actions really so simple, right? Are they really something that can be automated, put into code, or do we have to ask difficult questions about them? So from a law and policy perspective, just to think about something like care coordination after a surgery, one question that comes up is a licensure question, right? The idea that a lot of the individuals that were involved in that in many medical systems would need to get a license from the state to be involved. And so if you are going to be outsourcing that to a computer system, would you also want to get some level of licensure or quality assurance or something like that for the computing system? That's going to be a big question. We can think about, for example, chatbot therapists, right? There may be programs out there, apps that are marketed as providing something like a therapist for those who either can't afford or who are calling it at difficult times, like the middle of the night. They want to get some level of comfort, assurance, advice. And there may well be automated chatbots giving that. But then the question becomes, we do license often or provide some level of education and certification for those who provide this type of sensitive mental health advice. Do we want to do the same in the case of the devices or chatbots that do that? A second question is institutional liability, right? Even if we decide not to do the licensure, there still might be very bad outcomes. You know, we can still imagine situations where there's some glitch, there's some error in the product. How far does that liability go? If the hospital has recommended Alexa or has used that as a platform, can Alexa be in trouble? Probably the case is that a company as large as Amazon, before allowing such a device to even be used in coordination with a hospital, would probably require the hospital to sign some sort of agreement that would disclaim all liability. But then the hospital is left with the liability, right? But it may not be their fault. And so these are difficult questions when we think about the errors that could happen, different types of predictable problems that could occur along the line of this AI-driven medical care. A third is malpractice. Are the same laws that govern malpractice, physician liability in cases of direct treatment, are those going to be transferable to the new devices that are on the horizon? Or are these going to be framed as something like a book that you might consult? You know, and that's something that's going to be coming up over and over in the adoption of AI and robotics in medical care, is to what extent is it possible to hold them to the same types of standards that a person would? The scholar Ryan Abbott from England has made a very interesting case about a direct parallel between, say, robots that do and AI that does the same things as humans do and humans themselves, and arguing for treating them in parallel ways. But there are others that are going to say that there are dynamics of institutional responsibility for what the robot does or AI does that might prevent that type of direct parallel. And then informed consent. Are people truly consenting to this AI, understanding it or not? And finally, privacy. Privacy will always be a major concern. And, you know, rather than talking about these further in the abstract, I want to give some concrete examples here. And so some of the concrete examples of how traditional medical professionals are challenged or enhanced by technology include, for example, caregivers who may find that there are robotic entities or avatars that will be assisting them or even replacing them in some contexts. There are even in the ICU, in the intensive care unit, the second example is a physician has long decided whether to maintain a patient on life support, saying, is this treatment futile or not? Is it just we should give up, or is there still some hope of a functional recovery? By contrast, in the future, we're probably going to see many more quote unquote death algorithms that predict likelihood of recovery based on thousands or hundreds of thousands of data points from dialysis machines, ventilators, other forms of monitoring, heart rate monitoring, that could say among, say, 100,000 or 1 million people in the data set that had, and looking within that data set at a subset that had the same type of vitals, predicting that group would experience a final passing within a number of weeks. That may well be used among many doctors and intensivists and hospitalists to help decide the course of treatment. Similarly, and on a lower stakes scenario, but only slightly lower stakes, we may move to a situation where dermatologists, rather than using merely their own eyesight, could use machine learning programs to compare any mole that they see to a set of 1 million cancerous and 1 million non-cancerous moles and sorting it into one category. As soon as that's available to the dermatologist, you're also going to see a lot of demand for it among individuals, right? Consumers, ordinary patients that are going to say, before I spend the time and perhaps have to wait months to see a dermatologist, I want a sense of whether this is really serious or not. And finally, this is something that already has happened for many years, moving from a situation where doctors are deciding if two drugs will interact with bad effects. This is one reason why Paxlovid is often, it's hard to get because doctors have to make a drug assessment about the potential effects between it and existing drugs that the patient is taking, to clinical decision support software advising on these drug-drug interactions. And just to make this a little more concrete, one of the questions that comes up with respect to licensure is, if we have a robotic caregiver, do we want some level of licensing or checking of how it works and what type of information it's recording? For example, this is the Paro robotic seal. It's been used in different nursing homes, and this seal is programmed to bat its eyes and to look as if it is deeply engaged with what the person who's looking at it is doing. And the questions arise as to what is it recording? How is it sensing its environment? How long are the recordings kept? All of those are interesting questions that raise the possibility of a need for further monitoring and regulation of this intervention. Another interesting stepping point or midpoint between, say, full automation and robotics and humans involved is an avatar used by a firm named CareCoach. And here, individuals, rather than having a 3D robot, they have an avatar that is a mechanically voiced animation of a pet, but it's actually voiced. This has been used in Massachusetts in the US, but the voice is coming from workers in the Philippines or in other lower cost labor destinations, and is being mediated and expressed through the robotic voice. And will ask things like, how are you doing? Have you taken a walk today, et cetera, as a form of monitoring of vulnerable elderly persons. Again, there are very interesting questions there about the nature of reimbursement here. Should the individuals behind the system be reimbursed the same way that, say, direct caregivers are? If not, how much less? And lots of other questions arise in the process of thinking about how to make a fair labor transition towards some of these more forms of mediated care. And of course, the intellectual property and what they say may eventually become used by robotics, right? You may have people at the beginning, but if all of their conversations are recorded, that may well become a corpus of information and language that could be used in a fully automated context in the future. Some of these concerns come down to, does it work, right? And can an elder or their family turn off this monitoring that may be necessary in the context of the avatar or the care robot? Is the robot capable of reaching a broad spectrum of potential clients? how do we even measure how well it works, right? One study looking at these types of care robots actually measured the cortisol in study participants' urine to figure out if the cortisol level was reduced, and that was sort of seen as a biomarker of stress reduction. So this is a really interesting question, but I think what it raises is not only these questions of does it work, but the further questions about how it works and should it work, right? Is this treating people in a sort of behavioristic way? We should also look behind the labor shortage idea. A lot of times the reasons why these robotics or AI are being used is because of an ostensible labor shortage. But of course, in many contexts, the labor shortage really is an indication of perhaps low wages for human caregivers. And so is that a way of addressing the issue? I think that in giving the big picture here, there's a classic idea in US health economics policy called the iron triangle. And the idea of the iron triangle is that there's a trade-off between the quality of care you get, access to care generally, and the cost of care. You can often improve one thing, you can sometimes improve two things, but it's extremely difficult to improve all three things in the triangle. And so whenever you see certain forms of automation or AI pushed in medicine as cost reduction, the first question to ask, I think, is, are we trading away quality? Are we potentially trading away access? Another way of framing this issue, and I think a very sophisticated way, is the law professor Nicholas Terry's trilemma between automation, value, and empathy. The idea being that you can, again, advance one of those three and potentially two of those three, but it's very hard to advance automation, value, and empathy at the same time. I think also in thinking about the death algorithm in the ICU, in the intensive care unit, the positive affordances there is that it will lend objectivity to a lot of these very difficult decisions. It can be an algorithmic supplement to doctors' clinical practice guidelines and offer some level of comfort and quantification, right? In the sense that if one really knows that there's never been a recovery of a patient given a certain set of vital statistics as processed by machine learning and AI, then that does provide some comfort for the caregiver or for the family member that may not want to continue treatment. But the troubling outcomes are also quite possible, right? This could rigidify funding and reimbursement guidelines. There may be insurance companies or public authorities that say that we will not pay for given care if the person scores below a certain score on this algorithm. Clashes of culture over how these decisions should be made, and even potential roles for this death algorithm in the allocation of resources and rationing. So these are all very difficult questions that policymakers have to grapple with. I'd also note that with triage, what happens, say, when hospitals use AI to triage which patients in the ER should be seen? What about whether to authorize an emergency room visit for someone suffering stomach pain? Very difficult differential diagnosis with respect to stomach pain. One problem that may arise is that people may alter their behavior to be recognized by the algorithm. Just as sometimes patients are asked, how bad is your pain on a 1 to 10 scale? One doctor recently said that the way to answer that is that if you want very strong pain drugs, you say an 8 or a 9, right? It's not really that there is an objective measure or projection there, right? And I'm certainly not endorsing that. I think that's a really scary effect. But I think that, as Hao Wang has argued in this really recent piece called Transparency as Manipulation, there are problems if the triage mechanisms and methods are kept secret, because then it's opaque and it's not really that responsible to the larger citizenry. But there are problems also if we reveal how the algorithm works exactly, because of this issue of gaming and an issue of potential interventions by individuals. So both of those are very difficult questions to be answered. Just to give you a very early example of clinical decision support and the decision rules there, this is just a sort of early form of code that could be used. And nowadays, things become much more complex. And I think as things become more complex, harder questions are raised about the use of AI in clinical decision support. When these questions are raised, I think a really nice typology that was put forward by Nichols and Price, Sarah Gerke, and Glenn Cohen in their article, Liability for Use of AI in Medicine, is to consider whether the AI recommendation, first of all, is for standard or non-standard care, and secondly, if it's correct or not correct, and thirdly, if a physician follows it. And as you can see, this results in at least 8 different possibilities. And we should look very closely at the possibility, first of all, that the doctor rejects an AI recommendation that is standard and is correct, clearly an issue for injury and liability. But also, very interesting question in terms of an AI recommending non-standard care that's incorrect, and the doctor follows it. These are the two red boxes on the chart of injury and liability, right? And how will the legal system deal with that potential liability and responsibility for someone who's following AI advice? That will be a critical question for courts around the world to answer. And I think that it's just highlighting the issue here, and I look forward to our discussion of it. There's also hypotheticals about to what extent our database is representative, right? Even if there's not a problem of tort liability for using, say, an unrepresentative database now, perhaps eventually there should be, because we know, thanks to books like Deep Medicine and research like by Adamson and Smith in JAMA Dermatology, that there are problems in terms of many databases not being adequately representative of minority skin types, of women. There's a book by Carolyn Criado Perez about the lack of women in many different medical research databases. And as that becomes better known, I've argued in past work in the Columbia Law Review that there should be liability for failure to make databases more representative. But there will be a lot of resistance to that because people say, well, if we're using a database, don't blame us that it's not perfect. So big tensions there. My final points now, and I see I'm out of time, sorry to go a little over, is that there's really three metaphors for the future of AI in the professions. The first is that it's going to be the meta expert, that AI that those behind AI, computer scientists analyzing data, will take on a role that will be something like they will be experts as to who is an expert. And that is AI above and beyond and judging the value of domain experts. I don't think we're going there for the many reasons I've given in this talk about the already seen difficulties of using AI to replace human professionals. A second option is a melting pot where the AI and the profession merge into some third thing or new practice. And that may well be happening in some forms of radiology and pathology right now, but I don't think it's going to happen to the core of medical practice. Instead, I think that we're going to see more of a peaceable kingdom where AI and the medical profession maintains their distinctiveness, but each learns a lot from the other. And I hope the conversation that we're about to begin can be an example of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Frank. It's terrific to get that overview, and I feel like we could probably talk for several hours about that and everything that you've raised. But look, I want to open up the conversation first by turning to Justin for your response to everything you've just heard from Frank and what you'd like to draw out, speaking as a medical professional rather than on the law and policy side.
Sure. Thanks very much, Kim. And thanks, Frank, for an excellent talk. Again, we could talk for many hours. One of the things I'd like to ask you is, in a legal or regulatory framework, how do we quantify and deal with aspects of care that are really difficult to quantify? Things like the care factor, the bedside factor, the fact that the nurses, doctors, and allied health professionals have got that human touch component. Whereas a lot of the way we see AI at the moment is decision-making, data-driven, if this, then that. How do we come to a quantification of what actually matters in medicine from a law and regulatory framework point of view?
This is a terrific question, I think. And I think that the demand for a quantifiable, say, percentage of risk in various scenarios is very strong. And I think that as there's more and better data, I think we will be able to quantify risk in various scenarios and to, for example, give the relative risk of various forms of treatment for various types of people. I think that's one of the critical issues here that I didn't address in my talk, but I think intersects with your question, is the question of both risk overall and personalized levels of risk. And we've certainly seen that with COVID, right? I mean, almost every 10 years, one goes beyond 20, from 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, et cetera, massive increases in risk by age, also some increases by gender and some other issues with males often being at more risk and things like that. And so this is a really interesting question, to sort of think about broadly, thinking about the whole array of different types of features and characteristics one can have of any particular patient. So my hope there, and this perhaps here is where I'm a dreamer, is that we will get more and better data about different drugs, different treatment regimens, different approaches to dealing with medical problems. And from that, we'll be able to follow the example of evidence-based medicine and the Dartmouth Atlas of Medical Care and find optimal care that is personalized. But I think that without that type of big data and a lot more data sharing and analysis, it's going to be hard to get there, to get to that sort of quantified risk level that I think you're quite rightly pointing to.
Can I just jump in there? Because something else that's raised by what Justin just said is, and it's coming up in the questions a little bit too, this question around mental health and what the mental health implications of replacing humans with robots might be. And, in your talk, you mentioned, empathy, like a triangle with empathy, automation, value, and empathy. Speaking as someone who works in a centre that looks at kind of automated decision-making, one of the questions we're constantly asking ourselves is, do we really want automation, or do we just want augmentation? Do we want, do we want to get the benefits we can from data-driven devices, data-driven research, but have that, in partnership with the human who provides the, the empathy side or the bedside manner or the other questions that are so important. Frank, I know you've written about this. Did you have a comment on that?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought up the automation versus augmentation divide, because I think that's really critical. And I think that in so many of these settings, the real question comes down to how do we divide out that level of that issue. And I just want to give an example from automated driving, because I think that's closer to a lot of our day-to-day understanding. One of the concerns that was raised about some automated vehicles is that they would be designed so that right before a crash or when there were signs of trouble, they would turn over responsibility to the driver, and then it was the driver's fault, right? And the worry in some augmentation scenarios is that many of the medical professionals might end up with a great deal of responsibility, but then without a lot of support in that background and an ability to, and as an institutional level, have institutional support to, say, contradict the advice or recommendation of an AI system. And so I think that the question of how we can get to better handoffs and better ways of informing people is a critical one. And that, I think, is going to take a lot of research into human-computer interaction. Ben Schneiderman has a wonderful recent book on AI and toward better AI. He is a human-computer interaction researcher who was at the University of Maryland, now is emeritus. Looking back on 30 years of research of how to develop optimal relationships or partnerships between computers and humans in various roles. And I think that HCI field is going to be one to watch in the future as we move toward an augmentation goal as opposed to the automation goal in so many of these areas.
Thank you. Another question that's come up in the questions, and I know comes up a lot in the literature, is the question about data and whether we have the right data to actually develop the kinds of AI or clinical, decision support or diagnosis systems that we want. Justin, I know that you have this project, Big Data for Little People. I was wondering if you have a view on whether we have the data, whether we have the programs in place to get the data that are going to be needed for any of this to work.
It's a superb point. What one's got to understand is that there is a huge diversity of data types within medicine, and some of them are highly organized, very well understood, and standardized, in particular standardized. So one of the particular areas that has seen more progress than not is medical imaging. So we've got standards, DICOM standards for reporting medical imaging and even how to store that data. So there are areas of medicine that are very well suited to initial automation. However, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got recording human interactions, recording human decisions, the mess of clinical notes that we all have to deal with, the old story about a doctor's handwriting. That type of information is phenomenally difficult to handle. There's progress being made, but you've got a very wide variety of data types in medicine. So my answer to your question is really it depends on which area of medicine you're looking at. Frank gave the example of things like melanoma diagnosis. And in that situation where you can precisely quantify how that picture is taken, that's an area where rapid progress can be made. But in the general practitioner's environment with a sick patient walking in off the street, that is a much harder environment to quantify, to digitize, to standardize. So depends on your area that you're interested in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. Because I've certainly noticed when you look at, say, the approvals that the FDA has made of AI in use in medicine so far, a lot of it has been around the imaging. I've always put that down to the fact that there's so much technical work in visual recognition, so that we can do things like make automated cars or the like. But what you're telling me is it's also about the data.
It is. And what we're also seeing, and Frank, from the United States, is the United States has driven and been part of a massive explosion in electronic health records. Barack Obama got it going in 2008 as part of the GFC recovery processes. And so EHRs are now genuinely big money and genuinely big sources of data within healthcare. And this is happening globally. But it's a work in progress. And there are areas where that data is not digitized, as I've referred to in the GP practice. And our little project, Big Data for Small People at the Children's Hospital, is aiming to try and digitize one of those bits of data that just simply isn't captured. And so we're quite a way away from saying all of the data is there, ready for some super smart AI algorithm to work on it.
Can I just follow up, Justin, because it occurs to me that you're talking there about standardization. I've seen a lot of calls in the literature in this space for, we need, standard clinical descriptions, we need standard ways to record the data, we need standard definitions of clinical tasks and the like. And I'm just wondering, who develops those standards? You say that exists in it. Is that a question for law and policy makers? Is it a question for technical people? Is it a question for medical people? Is it a question for the medical societies?
Look, that standardization and codification of medical terminology, diagnoses and that, but there are some areas that are extremely well explored. ICD-10 coding, international coding for diseases, is a well-known way of coding what diseases happen wherever they do to whomever. But with the bigger volumes of data that medicine is having to deal with, imaging, physiological data, there are big pushes to try and streamline that. There's a specific code called HL7, which is one of the interoperability standards for medical information, and there's a background governance architecture for that called FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. And so the data managers within hospitals are getting familiar with those types of protocols, those types of data standardization processes. And at hospitals where this is advanced to quite a degree, you'll find everyone knows the language, they know the terms, and they're familiar with it. Whereas in institutions that have had none of this happening, they'll go, "What are you talking about? I've never heard of that standard." So application is currently kind of ongoing, and it's very much a work in progress.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I keep having this talk about standards in AI. It's interesting to hear that from a different perspective than the usual ones. Frank, one of the questions that has come up and that's been quite popular on Slido, I noticed, is this question of how we avoid the use of AI creating a self-referential cycle. The use of AI changes the data that is measured, and that new data is then used to further train data. So one of the problems we know that arises with AI systems can be that problem of kind of learning and changing over time. And there are examples of that in the medical field. I'm wondering, because you're familiar with the way the medical regulators work, they have the job of approving medical devices and approving some of these AI systems. Do you think they're equipped to deal with this new technology? Do they need to change? Do they need different expertise? Are they the right regulators in this space? I just thought you might have some comment there.
It's a terrific question, right? And I think that this is, and the question that I think recurs across different areas of AI regulation is this difficulty of state capacity, of having the individuals in the state who are familiar with the very cutting edge, often because the salary differentials are so high. I mean, you routinely hear stories of professors of machine learning or AI at universities being offered 10 times their salary in the private sector. And so this, I think, is one very critical issue in terms of resources and trying to make sure that there are the resources available to medical regulators, that could be in part based on some type of tax on the industry or other sorts of user fees, et cetera, which is one of the ways that the US FDA has tried to keep itself funded in the midst of the just incredible growth of the type of issues that are it needs to address. But I think that it's your question also about the way in which the data can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies or can in other ways be biased. I do think that regulators are starting to get on top of that. I think that it's so dramatic, some of the problems, and I think that particularly the recent study by Ziad Obermeyer and others with respect to the use of insurance records to predict the need for further clinical care being pretty deeply biased, because the problem was that a lot of the minorities in the database were just not getting the care that they needed. And so therefore there was a lot of issues with respect to how that should be, how fair it would be and how unfair it is to use that type of data to condition and to further allocate care in the future. And so I think that that is something that they are sensitive to, but it's something that requires a pretty coordinated regulatory response and intervention at the national levels, and perhaps even in a multinational level. Unfortunately, there are multinational groups working on this type of AI standardization that I hope will be addressing this soon.
Kim, could I just jump in there? And the regulators issue is a fascinating one, and I'm curious about the impact of working in a specific healthcare sector in a specific country, because if you work in a country where there's a very strong profit motive within medicine in general, and there is the danger of what you've described, Frank, of big salaries on one side of the fence and nothing on the other, that's a tricky situation to work in. Whereas if you've got a more socialized healthcare model where the disparities are not as big, you might be able to have a regulatory system that is up to snuff, that is actually able to cope with the volume of work that this is going to generate, because it's going to be big. What are your thoughts on, the national level challenges that different countries might have?
I really like that way of framing it. I think that's a very good way of framing it in terms of thinking about how all of the issues we address under the rubric of AI bias, AI discrimination, other issues like that, they're embedded in larger political economic systems. And that is going to, and particularly this is a helpful perspective in thinking about the role of leadership of jurisdictions that have, say, a less profit-oriented system than the US often is, where there are lots of pressures to be using whatever data is to hand, or to try to rapidly scale up applications, as opposed to taking, say, a more slow and deliberate and considered approach. So I think that's right, and I think that there is some hope there, and there's something. One reason why I'm on this trip is to learn more about the way things are done here in Australia, and to learn further about and to be able to be better poised for the comparative research that you're suggesting. So thanks.
I think that's a really interesting point. Speaking of profit motives, can I take us in a slightly more speculative direction? Because one thing that stuck out in the news to me just in the last week or so was Amazon acquiring, what was it called? One Medical, which is a kind of, it's a primary care provider, right? It has doctors who see patients all over the country. And it's interesting to see a big tech company like Amazon investing in primary healthcare. That's not intuitive that that's their business. They sell books and a whole lot of other movies and things like that. And I'm wondering what the impact of acquisitions and the move of the very large tech companies into this space might be. One of the concerns that people raise is the privacy one, which you raised in your presentation, the question about what that means for consumers. But I'm also wondering, particularly with something like an acquisition of a primary care provider, where doctors are working and meeting with patients and the results of that are presumably being recorded, what that might mean for doctors and other clinicians, right, and other healthcare providers, right? Amazon, for example, has a reputation for monitoring its employees and what they're doing and how they're making decisions. And one can't help but think that, Amazon would be interested in looking at not just the patients, but potentially the doctors, doctors who might be employees, and looking at their decision-making, perhaps seeking to influence that decision-making or explore how doctors make decisions and what some of the outcomes of that might be. And I'm just wondering, do you have any comment on that? If we focus a lot when we're talking about AI and health on the impact on consumers, on individuals, on the care that they receive. Just wondering if you have any comment on the potential impact on doctors.
I'm so glad you asked this question, Kim. Of course, I should defer to Justin here.
You first, Frank.
Because I do think that it's a great question, right? And I think part of, and Justin already mentioned the big push for electronic health records in the US. The way a lot of physicians interpreted and experienced that was as a sudden increase in unpaid labor, where they were essentially forced to do a huge amount of data entry in often very unfamiliar and bulky systems with terrible user interfaces. And so this cuts both ways with respect to big tech coming in, because my bet would be, and I apologize to anyone who works at Epic Health Systems or Cerner or the big EHR systems, but my bet would be that Apple or Google would come up with a more usable user interface for electronic health records than what the dominant incumbents in the US have come up with. And so therefore, I think that's the promise there. And the promise there also is of, incredible capacities for data aggregation and for long-term investment. And to the extent that, the state shrinks from this long-term investment, and it should be done, I can see a lot of people welcoming a Google or Amazon or others to do that type of investment. But you're exactly right to say that there is the problem of de-skilling. This was one of the best books on automation I've read overall is Nicholas Carr's The Glass Cage, Automation and Us. And he talks about this problem of de-skilling, and he does a case study in particular on pilots and how the work of piloting a plane is very difficult, has been largely automated, but there are ways of automating it that preserve a pilot's sense of skill and autonomy, and those that don't. And you have to worry about that, particularly in a firm like Amazon, which has been so often criticized for very harsh labor practices. So I think that's an issue that I think really deserves to be brought front and center at the competition policy level. And I think what's so interesting now is whether competition law policy will be able to evolve and think about the potential social and consequences of conglomeratization of more and more things being brought into larger and larger companies like healthcare and Amazon, or if it'll just be sort of stuck in its own older mode of largely only combating cartelization of a particular industry.
Justin, did you want to add anything?
Not sure where to start. It's a juicy set of options to talk about. Just going back to the potential impact of the big tech companies getting involved in healthcare. I don't think one can strongly be for or against. The reality is the big tech companies have accrued a vast skill set over the past 15 years, leveraging purchasing data, search data, or social media data. And it would be crazy for healthcare systems not to benefit in some way from that. As a disclaimer, I must announce that I have had some discussions with Amazon Web Services, their public domain assistance group. But the discussions there are based on trying to set up systems that actually help public sector healthcare environments. And so this is where the regulatory and legal components come into full view. If we get those policy settings right, then the big tech groups can interact with healthcare patient data generated by public healthcare systems in a way that's open and transparent, and then everyone gets to benefit. But if it becomes an extreme of either option, then you just have, a more sort of dystopian take on data that's, grabbed by large corporations and used for their own purposes. So it's where the legal and regulatory components will need to overcome those before we can see them in actual clinical practice.
I love that. That's terrific, particularly for this panel. Look, I've been drawing on the Slido questions as we go along, but we're rapidly running out of time. So I'm just going to see if I can get some quick responses to a few of the questions that have come up. One, this seems aimed very much at you, Justin, in a lot of ways. How do we navigate what seems to be a paradox of the gut feeling and its importance and the problems that that might bring up with bias?
Sure. Look, the gut feeling that sits within any healthcare provider when they feel that, that child over there is just not quite well enough in the ED and you need to take special care of them is something that's been around since humans have been taking care of each other. And it's very difficult to quantify. It accumulates over time, and it's very difficult for experts to put their finger on exactly what it was. So in the 1980s, when we were trying to develop expert systems to make decisions upon specific things, if this, then that type of logics, it was incredibly difficult to codify why the senior clinicians ended up being correct more often than not. It doesn't, however, mean they are always correct. And I think personally that our reliance on that gut feeling in medicine probably causes more harm than good on average. Sorry to break it to you, that's a personal point of view, but I would favor a more open, protocolized set of processes in a large number of areas of medicine. So we do need to maintain that gut feeling. It's the autonomy of the doctors and nurses that take care of you at some level, but I don't think we should overtrust it. They need to work hand in hand.
Could I jump in just to follow up on that? Because I think that's such an interesting point. And I recently just saw a very similar argument in the legal context by Chris Slobogan. He has a book called Just Algorithms. And the idea is that in making decisions about sentencing, that we should aim for algorithmic sentencing. And then the second meaning of just is, he says, it should just be the algorithm, no human intervention. And the question that I have is perhaps a middle ground in the medical context might be to require documentation for going against the evidence-based practice or going against the AI. Do you think that is a possibility there, Justin, that like possibly we could just say, if you're going to go against what is the standard advice or the AI advice, that you really have to document why you're doing it?
Sure. Not referring to AI systems in particular, but in healthcare in the last probably 10 to 20 years, there's seen a drive towards increased protocolization of a number of different processes in medicine. And with the backstory being that if you protocolize those processes, you get obvious improvements in care. To the legal audience that I'm assuming is mainly gathered out there, some of the stuff might be a bit hair-raising for you, but it would be protocolization of really simple processes, things like giving an antibiotic before surgery, or when you're putting a drip in, you have to be quite specific about how you clean the skin. There are things where clinicians can often decide to just do their own thing. Oh, it doesn't matter, I know what I'm doing type decisions. However, if you force them all onto the rail and make sure they actually follow those protocols, you end up with better results. And so even in a non-AI type environment, there's good evidence for protocolization, but exactly where that fails and you need to then rely on gut instinct and the more general skills of a senior clinician, that's very hard to determine. So yeah, sorry, not a clear answer, but it's a tricky area.
Now, I'm really conscious of the time. We are just about out, but I think there's an important theme in a couple of the questions from Slido that I just want to raise for your final comments before we wrap things up, and that is the theme of exclusion. So one of the questions is raised about Indigenous data and the exclusion of Indigenous peoples around the world from some of the data sets and whether we risk leaving them behind again. And also, access for developing countries and other, people of lower socioeconomic background, or, are we risking some sort of two-tier system, or even just like people not having access? So just quick thoughts on that before we have to turn back to our Sydney Ideas hosts.
We've been dealing with this, jump in there. The problem we have is regression to the mean. And if we've got a very, very large set of people or data points, and we aggregate them together, the danger is that the large volume data points will swamp the small volume data points. And that applies to blood pressures, and it applies to cultural groups, gender, all kinds of other issues. And so it's very important for us to be aware of exactly what components are in those data sets. And then this is where I would defer to the data scientists. We need to correct for that. The most important, the most lethal biases are the ones that are invisible and not acknowledged. And so bias may exist in a data set, but at least if you acknowledge it's there and you've got some method of compensating for it. So that would be my 2 bits worth. Frank?
Yeah, I think this question of bias and access is such an important one. And I think that, there's going to be ongoing, speaking of protocolization with respect to best practices in AI in terms of trying to make sure that data sets are adequately representative and what the standard should be. And I know that there's, I think Carlos Bustamante was working on this with respect to DNA databases, and I think the same type of lessons are going to be learned with respect to all manner of medical databases. I do think also the question of 2-tier is so interesting, Kim, and it's one of the things I'm starting to work on now is the use of AI as a screening tool. Because I think that there's in systems, say there's a medical system, and I heard this about the NHS, although I've not verified it. There may be parts of the NHS that, in England that may not have enough radiologists, or it might take months to see a radiologist. AI may be used as triage to say these are the scans that most need to be seen in a system like that. And so on the one hand, this certainly does seem to be like a more rational allocation of resources than just brute luck or who is first in line. On the other hand, there's a grave concern about some people not being recognized by the AI, even though they should be, or even if there were other screening mechanisms, they might have gotten more immediate care. So I think both of those are really interesting questions, and you could well have a future where in various areas, before you get to see a professional with very scarce time or scarce professionals, you have to go through the AI screen first. And I think that's raise a lot of tough issues for regulators.
Quick point, Kim. Bias exists in medicine in every single nook and cranny of medicine, or at present, and that's obvious to anyone in the area and most people outside of it. So perhaps AI can help us identify those little areas of bias. The data systems can actually say, no, hang on, you're excluding that patient's symptoms on the basis of X, Y, and Z. So perhaps it may not be a hindrance, it may actually be assistance if we get it right.
I love that idea. And although there's a part of me that just wants to keep this conversation going because it is so good. That's a great point to end on. And we are out of time, but for my sake, just thank you. Thank you for this conversation, because I feel like we've touched on a lot of really, really important issues. And can we do it again sometime?
Absolutely. I'd love to. Yes.
All right. Back to you, Fenella.
Thank you so much, Professor Kimberly Weatherall. Thank you, Frank Pasquale, and thank you, Justin Scono. That was an absolutely brilliant conversation and so beautifully chaired. So thank you so much for joining us here at Sydney Ideas. It's been such a privilege to hear from the 3 of you. And Frank, thank you for joining us and that wonderful presentation that you did at the top. This has been Sydney Ideas. You can find out more about our program, of course, at the Sydney Ideas website. And this conversation will be up online, both the podcast and the video, in the coming days. Thank you so much for joining us at Sydney Ideas, and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.